My name is Diana Liverman, and I co-direct the Institute of the Environment at the University of Arizona here with Jonathan Overpeck, who's somewhere out in the audience. And I'd like to welcome you to the University of Arizona and to the second Adaptation Futures Conference. Adaptation to climate variability and climate change has been part of my life for decades. And I want to start by acknowledging the many people who I've learnt from, some of whom are here, and the many students who I've had the privilege to work with on issues of climate adaptation. And that personal commitment to climate adaptation is one of the reasons why we agreed to host the second conference. And it was 2 years ago that many of us were on the Gold Coast in Australia when the Australian CSIRO and NCARF organized a fantastic conference on adaptation where they had no idea how many people would come together. But that conference created a real community that I think has matured, has stayed in touch with each other over the 2 years since. And I wanted particularly just to quickly mention one person who we really wish was here, who was at the Australian conference, who was Steve Schneider, who we all miss greatly. Terry, his wife, is here with us, so we do remember Steve today. He was my PhD advisor. I did want to point out that we have arranged for live streaming of the plenaries. So if you want to send a Twitter or a tweet, or if you want to let your friends know around the world that the plenaries will be live, go to the main conference webpage, and you'll see here at the top it says that the plenaries are being streamed live. The final thing I want to say in terms of logistics is I'll be saying this a lot, but I very much want to thank the sponsors of the conference. That includes the University of Arizona Institute for the Environment, and I thank PEC for letting me take the risk on organizing the conference. University of Arizona Water, Energy, Environment Solutions Program, which is a university-wide program supporting environmental research. Our partner, and you'll hear from Martin Parry in a minute, United Nations Environment Program and WMO have a program called ProVia, who is the co-organizer of the conference with us. Australia's CSIRO very generously provided some support for the conference. The US Agency for International Development came through to bring many of the developing world participants to the conference. And then there are groups that are sponsoring individual sessions, like the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. Oxford University provided some funding. And above all, I want to thank Tom McDonald, who's been our conference coordinator. But let's wait to see if it all goes well before we give him a round of applause at the end of the meeting. And I want to thank the organizing committee. Now, briefly, I want to tell you where everybody's from, and then we can move ahead with the program. We have between 700 and 750 people here, and they're from more than 60 countries. We think we had 66 countries, but then I realized that Elsevier, who I should also thank, who did the conference program, Elsevier is not a country, at least not yet. We have people from many different parts of the world. Of course, the geography location of the conference explains why we have more than 300 people from the US and Canada. But I would say that many of them are students, and many of them are actually from other parts of the world. They're studying in the United States or Canada or working here. Within that group, there are people from all over, but I want to give a particular shout out to a small city that is just over the border of Arizona into New Mexico. Silver City, New Mexico, which has a population of 10,000 people, is really concerned about climate change and wants to do something about it. So we have a delegation of 12 people from Silver City, New Mexico. So if you want to find out about living and adapting in a small city in the Southwest, they can tell you about it. We have more than 60 people here from Australia and New Zealand. Actually, we have 72 people from Australia and New Zealand. So, and we feel that we share a lot of challenges, particularly with the arid regions of Australia. We've got about 100 people here from Europe. We've got 100 people here from Asia, 50 people from Africa, half a dozen from the Middle East, and 40 from Latin America. So finally, I just want to ask you to really enjoy your time here, to take the chance to meet new people. Don't just talk to your old friends. There is free internet. You just go to UA Public, and then your browser will ask you, and you just accept the conditions. But I ask you not to spend your whole time on the internet. This is about people, not about the internet. So spend time meeting people, finding new collaborators, and creating a new sense of community around climate adaptation. So I would now like to turn over to my co-chair, Martin Parry. Many of you know Martin very well. He's had a distinguished career as a climate impact researcher. He actually has had one of the jobs I had as director of the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford, but has taught at several other universities, but is perhaps best known for his work as chair of IPCC Working Group 2 through several iterations, and Martin has now handed over to Chris Field, who is here as well from IPCC Working Group 2. So I'd like to thank Martin for putting trust in U of A to try to help organize this conference. So Martin.
Thank you very much. Now, so you don't have to look at my ugly mush, I'm going to get the first slide onto the screen straight away. No, I haven't done that quite right. How do I get this? There we go. Wait. No, back one. There we are. Right. Thanks very much, Diana, and welcome everyone. And thank you also to the University of Arizona and its president, and Tucson City and its mayor for welcoming us here. And thank you very much indeed for coming. How did I lose that? Okay. As Diana said, 2 years ago, a colleague of ours who is here, Jean Palutikov, started planning for a conference at the Gold Coast in Australia, which was very successful, which we then sat back and thought during that meeting, what can be the legacy of this? And Diana picked up the baton. But we hadn't yet thought that this would be continuing every other year on every other year conference. But that's what we want it to be. And we would like the every other year international conference on adaptation to climate change, the Provea conference, to be the place where adaptation experts will come. Not just academics, but increasingly practitioners, engineers, farmers, those involved in construction, whoever. And we feel that I've got certain things on here, there's a little delay. And in between, you have to look at me. Right. Provea very much wanted to be part of this scene and to be the agent that carries things forward from year to year. And in 2 years' time, as you can see from the previous slide, we are well advanced in plans for a conference. I won't say where. We've had offers of countries to host this from around the world, and some very strong bids. And that'll be announced by my colleague, my succeeding chair, my successor chair of Provea, Salim Hook, who will be speaking to you in the last plenary session today, and will announce where that will be. Provea is a program of research. Okay, let me just see what's happening here. It's on there for a while and then it goes off, is that correct? That's not a problem, just to alert me, or I will watch the screen occasionally. Provea was launched a couple of years ago by the UN Environment Programme. It stands for the Programme of Research on Climate Change Vulnerability impacts and adaptation, and it was launched because it felt there was an important gap to fill. Most of you, I think, looking at you in this room are not old enough to remember that at one point, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we had a seat at the high table of international coordination of climate change through the World Climate Impacts and Responses Programme. But in due course, around about 2000, from a program of several tens of millions of dollars that slowly sort of withered on the vine, and effectively became a few projects and was inactive as a program. And that's why UNEP and others felt it very important to relaunch that, and it's been relaunched as a different named program, Provea. So that's where we sit in the UN World Climate Program, and the director of that World Climate Program, Dr. Siva Kumar, is here in the audience. And the purpose of Provea is to provide that international coordination of work on vulnerability impacts and adaptation, to prioritize research and help access funds, to direct funds to that, or encourage funds, and to communicate the new knowledge that arises increasingly from the work that you do and others not represented here to governments. And you'll see in the first 4 initial activities, I hope, these objectives reflected. We are prioritizing by discussion with governments, many of you in this room, individuals and agencies and institutes, where are the main gaps in knowledge that represent a barrier to progress in adaptation at the highest level. And we have a draft headline list of priorities that you can look at now on our website. We are starting to play a role in discussions with the UNFCCC and other international initiatives to help be a conduit, if you like, of new knowledge on adaptation through to those corridors of power. We want to be a part of achieving a greater coherence in our research community, particularly on adaptation, and this conference and the biennial process of that is a part of it. That's why Provea is very happy to be a co-sponsor with you and your university, Diana, in this. And finally, we feel that there is a role to be performed, and Provea has picked up that baton in trying to improve the robustness and rigor of our methods that we use in VI and A assessment. And there is a first full draft of the Provea guidance drafted by Richard Klein, again in this room, and his colleagues at SEI Stockholm and elsewhere, the Provea guidance on methods of assessment, and you can look at that also on the website. Okay, pause here for a moment while I say, I want to now tell a 3-minute story, which I did in 2 years ago in the Gold Coast First Adaptation Conference, and I don't think I can tell it better there. Not that I told it particularly well at that time, but you know, I'm an old tosser now, and you can't teach a leopard new tricks or spots, or am I mixing my metaphors here? And that is, I used the Working Group 2 IPCC table of incremental impacts of climate change as they ramp up with global warming, which is very detailed, which is why I just wanted to pause before I press the button here. You don't try to see it, I just got to sort of plot some things on here. And it looks like this sector by sector, and if you could see the details, but you can go to the IPCC website or the volumes themselves, and you can see that. And at the right-hand side, plotted in a dusty yellow, is a central outcome of most projections of an unmitigated climate change by the end of this century, something like 4 to 5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels, but we've experienced 0.7 degrees warming already, and this is graphed to current temperatures, so everything is half a degree warmer already on this slide, and that's a huge adaptation challenge. That's my story in a way, and it's an obvious one you'll be familiar with, and it's really quite daunting. We've made a start by, at Durban, agreeing a target of 100 billion a year for mitigation and adaptation, the climate fund. And if we assume that a half of that is spent, the money isn't there yet, well, fractions of it are, but by 2030 it will be, let's say, 50 billion a year. The estimation for that need was developed through a number of studies, particularly the World Bank, that actually carried different baselines. And the lines here I've drawn reflect the limits to adaptation that these experts' analysis concluded could be achieved if the technology could be deployed with that amount of finance. So they assume no adaptation in ecosystems, it's not costed in. No adaptation to extreme events like collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet or change in the North Atlantic oscillation, and quite different amounts. Well, one could draw this line in different ways, but I've just taken that to show you there are some implied limits in the analysis that led to the estimation of a need between 40 and 50 billion a year by 2030, and we're spending, as I say, perhaps 1/100th of that at the moment. But at the other end, we know, in the corridors of power and the smoke-filled rooms and other metaphors you might like to use, there is a lot of talking going on by our colleagues in mitigation of efforts to draw down the rate of emissions. And if all the pledges that were made at Copenhagen and taken further in Mexico and then in Durban were fully implemented, this is one estimation, not by me, but European models, including the Hadley Centre in the UK, as to where the equilibrium outcome of climate might be at around the end of this century, about 3 degrees warming. So I plotted it at 2.5 here, because we've had 0.5 or 0.7 degrees. So let's say that that is the perfect outcome of all the pledges so far, which of course have not even started to be implemented. We're left with something like this, a big gap in the middle, drawn schematically like this. And of course you could argue about details, indeed some of the substance, but that's my little story about where the challenge is. It is absolutely huge. Now, if I were a politician, I would say something like, but of course we can rise to the challenge. You know, we can do it. You and subsequent generations of adaptation scientists and experts and the practitioners who are not fully represented here can do this. I have total confidence that you can do it. Well, I'm not as optimistic as that, and I think reality is truly daunting. But whether we can do it or not, we don't know now, but at least we've got to make a start. And that's why we're here, and that's why Previa is really pleased to be a co-sponsor of this conference with you, and I wish you all success. And as Diana said, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So we have 3 people to welcome you to this place and this country. And they're 3 people who I greatly admire, and actually makes me proud to be in Tucson and at the University of Arizona. And I'd like to begin by introducing our relatively new mayor, Jonathan Rothschild. The mayor was born and raised in Tucson, so he's a local Tucsonan. We have a lot of migrants to this area from all over the country and the world, but he's proud to be from Tucson. He's an attorney. He ran his own part of a firm in Tucson for a number of years. He graduated from University of New Mexico Law School, and he's been the managing partner in his law firm until 2011. But the reason why I believe the mayor was elected is his very long tradition of extensive service to the community. He worked with Casa de los Niños that helps children. He worked with the Jewish Services for the Aging. He served on the boards of a number of local organizations, including the Tucson Medical Center, the Friend of the University Library. He's a member of the Tucson Parks and Recreation Commission, and he's worked as an adjunct professor at the university and as a member of Operation Deep Freeze. And for those of us who live in the community and have been receiving his newsletter, we know that he has a very active commitment to sustainability and to the future of the city. So, Mayor Rothschild, thank you for...
On behalf of the City of Tucson, I welcome you to the International Conference on Adaptation and Climate Change. I'm so glad to see so many people here who are willing to learn, discuss, and find solutions to this critical problem. Of course, You are glad and should be glad to be here at the University of Arizona, which is an institution that has led the efforts in this country in climate change research and adaptation. As many of you may know, our region, where you are today, is at the center for potential impacts of future climate change. The record of drought from the rings of ancient trees, research that was done here at the University of Arizona Tree Ring Lab, tells us that in Tucson and the Colorado River Basin, which is our main renewable source for water, has been subject to a drought for over 50 years. In the Sonoran Desert, where you are today, we are at great risk for heat-related climate change, fires, increased energy requirements, and even heat-related illnesses. In response, the City of Tucson committed to the United States Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement in 2006. We formed a Climate Change Committee in 2009, and I am proud of the diversity of that Tucson Climate Change Committee. It includes members of the business community, civic leaders, community activists, university scientists, architects, and others. The work of this committee is ongoing and necessary for our continued sustainability in our community. In December 2011, as one of my first acts after being elected mayor, I signed a climate change mitigation plan to reduce the City of Tucson's greenhouse gas emissions. The city has also partnered with the University of Arizona to get the best research in climate impacts and vulnerabilities for our region, working with the Institute of the Environment, the College of Science, the College of Agriculture, the School of Geography, and the Udall Center for Public Policy. We in the city hope to get the best science-based information to make public policy decisions. In Tucson, we are lucky to have tremendous expertise from internationally recognized adaptation thinkers like Diane Liverman, like Dr. Jonathan Overpeck, and from a continuing body of work as has been developed by the Pima County Sonora Desert Conservation Plan. And this plan has been cited nationally as a model for showing communities how they can work across jurisdictions to enhance the ecological resilience of vulnerable open spaces like our Sonoran Desert. In Tucson, the city controls the water, and Tucson Water has been a national trendsetter for planning and conserving our most precious resource. Tucson has adopted a rainwater harvesting ordinance, is a Solar America city, has made substantial investments in solar for its public buildings, and has an active program to plant desert-adopted trees that require no supplemental irrigation to reduce the urban heat island effect along our streets. We work across the border with our friends in Mexico, particularly with Agua de Hermosillo, to enhance regional water management plans. And I welcome our friends from across the border here at this conference today. The city is also a part of the Multi-City Water Adaptation Alliance with Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Flagstaff, and a number of other cities. This alliance has allowed the city to share and receive best practices from other municipalities. It is in that effort that I welcome all of you here to our city. And as mayor, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that while it is warm at the end of May here in Tucson during the day, our nights are beautiful, and there is plentiful eating, shopping, and recreation opportunities, and I urge you to see our beautiful city and get out in it. Enjoy Tucson, learn, share, and work to make the earth a better place. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mayor. Now like to introduce our wonderful president of the University of Arizona, Dr. Eugene Sander. He's the 20th president of the University of Arizona, and he's been president since for about a year, and he will be stepping down in a month. He has been an enormous supporter of work on the environment and climate at the University of Arizona, particularly in his role as he was provost, but he was also the long-term dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, where he oversaw 11 academic departments and 2 schools, agricultural experiment station, and was also director of cooperative extension. Gene is a biochemist with degrees from the University of Minnesota and Cornell. He taught at Texas A&M and the University of Florida and was also in office in the U.S. Air Force. We're particularly grateful to him for his role in helping bring a whole generation of new faculty to the University of Arizona in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, many of whom are working with a team. I think we now have about 50 people across the university who declare an interest in climate adaptation. So we're very grateful to Gene, who will welcome you to the University of Arizona.
Well, thank you, Diana. Thank you for the warm words. I really appreciate it. Mr. Mayor, thank you for giving my speech for me. It's wonderful always to follow a political leader from your own community. Yesterday, my wife and I took a little drive out in the country. We haven't had too much of an opportunity to do that in the past year. And we were driving down Highway 188, which is about a 50-mile spin between, we were coming back from Payson, Arizona, and you drive right alongside Lake Roosevelt. Lake Roosevelt is the principal storage body for water for the entire Salt River project, which essentially supplies water for all of the Phoenix area. It's interesting, we stopped for gas along there, and I was listening to 2 guys complaining about the difficulty they were having launching 20-foot boats. And it was interesting to me in that I can remember having been here in Arizona for a while when that reservoir was close to being full. It is now down in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 feet, and here we have, obviously, some Phoenicians who, instead of worrying about what the lack of water might do to their lifestyle, were instead worrying about how they're going to put a 20-foot boat in the water. The point of bringing this to your attention is that I think, as I look at this business of adaptation to climate change, I'm old enough and I've had enough of a career that I can remember when we went through the first shock, the idea that the climate was going to change. I shall never remember myself looking at those slides of the glaciers that were in Science magazine, those pictures. I also remember having a good friend, a climatologist at the University of Florida, worked for the USDA lab down there by the name of Hartwell Allen. He was a climatologist. I'm a physical biochemist. You wouldn't think we would have an awful lot to talk about, except in my background is a large farm in the Red River Valley of Minnesota, about 200 miles from the Canadian border. And we were talking about a paper that Hartwell was getting ready to publish, I forget, Science or Nature, but it was one or the other. It was a high-class journal. And he was trying to tell me about it. And I said, okay, Hartwell, cut to the chase. What do I need to know that's in that paper? And he looked at me and he says, well, Gene, he said, you come from the Red River Valley of Minnesota. I'd advise you to buy land in Canada. Well, this was in the 80s. Fast forward now to the second conference on climate adaptation. You are still a group of climatologists. You are people who worry about what we are going to do in this matter of change. I look at your program, outstanding papers, no question about it, but let's fast forward now 20 years into the future and see who is going to be at, let's say, the 25th conference that you might hold on climate adaptation. And here I would argue you might have in your audience some of the world's finest plant molecular biologists, people who are worried about what can be done about crop plants that will grow on 25% of the water they currently take. There might be physicians that are worried about what can be done about making the place a little bit more hospitable for human habitation. I would imagine you will have engineers, hydrologists, again, who are also worried about things we can do on how to do more with less water. But the point is, I think we have come from a stage of, gee, what a shock this is going to happen, to what I would call right now the oh my God stage. It is happening, and what are we going to do about it? To perhaps then in the future, what we have done that will make a tremendous difference to places like, to things such as agriculture, et cetera. And it's appropriate that we look at things like that very carefully at a university like the University of Arizona. We sit in the southwest part of the United States. Without the Colorado River, well, you can go back and look at what happened to the Hohokam Indians. It's that sort of thing that perhaps we have to face unless we learn to live an awful lot smarter and do things quite differently than we do right now. So again, I want to welcome you to the University of Arizona. You are in the heartland as a university of an institution that has worried about things like this for many, many, many years, although perhaps we didn't use the same terminology and the urgency may not have been quite as great. But again, I wish you the very best and have a great conference. Thank you.
And now we have someone who is our official representative from Washington, but she's also one of our own, a faculty member who is on leave to the White House from the University of Arizona. So I'd like to introduce Kathy Jacobs. Kathy is the Assistant Director for Climate Assessment and Adaptation at the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House, where she works closely with the administration, John Holdren, the chief scientist. She's also the Director of the National Climate Assessment, which she will be talking about during the conference, which is evaluating impacts of climate change across the U.S. She's developing the country's national adaptation strategy. She is a core member of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. But before she went to Washington to do all those important things, she has a long history of research on water and on issues of climate change in Arizona. She was a water manager, so unlike many of us, she's had a real life in the practitioner's world. She has not worked only in academia. She was the executive director of the Arizona Water Institute. She directed the Tucson Active Management Area, and she has a degree from the University of California, Berkeley. At the University of Arizona, she's in the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Science. And although we miss Kathy and would like her to come back, she's doing very important work in Washington during a tough time. So, Kathy Jacobs.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Diana. Diana should know better, but when I asked her what I should talk about, she said I could talk about anything I wanted to, so I will. When I stand up in front of people, I normally talk about the National Climate Assessment because that's what's sort of eating my lunch at the moment. But this gives me an opportunity to talk about my other favorite topic, which is adaptation, and they're actually very closely related topics. I want to start by welcoming you on behalf of the Obama administration, but I also want to talk a bit more about opportunities associated with the community building that can happen here at this conference, talk a little bit about the reality check of what we're all observing across the countryside, but then I hope make you understand that there is a lot going on in Washington related to climate activities, and then finally talk a little bit about the path forward. So to start out, I want to tell you what an enormous pleasure it is for me to be here today welcoming you. It's an amazing honor. I'm very proud to work for John Holdren in this administration. He is a strong supporter of all that you are doing here today, and has been a great power behind a lot of transformation that's going on in the government. He sends you his greetings and regrets that he was not able to be here himself. It's also a pleasure to work with Diana Liverman yet again. The two of us have been partners in crime on many occasions, and this is yet another of Diana's Herculean efforts. There's obviously a small army of people marching in lockstep behind Diana, but she does amazing things every time she takes on a new task. As you can all imagine, there was probably a lot of midnight oil being burned behind the scenes to get all this together, but I'm sure that there were a large number of carbon credits that were acquired in response to that. This is really a big deal. Another one of Diana's big deals is that she's actually on the advisory committee for the National Climate Assessment, where she's on the, she actually helps us out with writing the whole report. And as soon as she's done with this conference, we're going to have her full-time on the assessment. I also wanted to thank the University of Arizona, and particularly President Sander. They've been incredibly generous, sort of allowing me to run off to Washington and tilt at my own personal windmills. I think they're probably windmills that are shared by a number of you. So I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities associated with working on adaptation. Clearly, we do live in challenging times, and I think many of us who work on adaptation are very daunted by the day-to-day challenges that we face. Working on these topics and sustainability topics in general makes all of you heroes, and I take my hat off to all of you. I mean, the people in this room have an enormous amount of heart, and you're here because you care about future generations and about the environment that we live in. And you do all of this at great personal sacrifice. I don't think there's probably a person in this room who doesn't do most of this because you're doing it for the right reasons, not because of any other, anything else that sort of brings you to this topic. I'm here today with my colleague Susan Rufo, who is out here in the audience somewhere, from the Council on Environmental Quality. The two of us work on the National Adaptation Strategy for the White House, and we want to reassure you that those of us who are in Washington are working to support your efforts to the best of our ability. We have very challenging times. It's not easy, but there is a lot going on behind the scenes, as I hope you'll hear in just a minute. Climate change is an international problem, and the solutions that we develop need to be international. And for that reason, we're thrilled to welcome you all here to the United States so that we can be together to share ideas across the boundaries and to be inspired by each other's work. It's great that this event is held in Tucson, not only because it gives me an opportunity to actually say hello to my husband, but because I have lived and worked here for 30 years on water-related issues and solving the kinds of adaptation challenges that we are all here to work on. So now for that was the pep talk part. This is the reality check part. In this global economy, we are facing so many difficult challenges, and many of the people we are trying to help are impacted by poverty and conflict and environmental degradation. It's not always clear which of these challenges we should prioritize, given how interdependent all of the human, natural, and social systems are. Adaptation is a complex and scientifically challenging topic, and it can be expensive in a time when resources are hard to come by. But everyone in this room knows that failure to adapt in an anticipatory way costs more, whether it's costing more in money or it's costing more in quality of life or any other way that we might pay. It's important for us to make these investments now. But our social, physical, and environmental predictive tools are not yet up to the challenge of helping us know exactly where and when we should be making these investments in order to do the best job of protecting the people and the systems that we care about. There are cascading events happening across the globe today. This is not just about what happens in the future, and we need to be really smart to deploy what we do know as soon as we can to try to limit the impacts as much as possible. There is a role for science and technology in addressing all of these issues, but I would argue that the larger challenge, at least in the United States, comes from a worldview that does not adequately focus on sustainability of the human and environmental systems that we are all dependent on. This is a bigger challenge than the science and technology challenges that are very much a part of this reality. Science has already prepared us with a myriad of tools and benefits, ranging from improvements in food production, to energy supply, to transportation and communications, to health care. But if we don't recognize how important it is to protect the basic systems that support our food, water, and energy supply, or to recognize the challenges ahead for our built infrastructure and the health of our citizens, that will really limit what science and technology can do for us to reduce risk and increase resilience. As Dr. Holdren often says, we have three choices: to adapt, to mitigate, or to suffer. And what I say in response is we don't have three choices, we have one choice. And the choice is, in what proportion are we going to adapt, mitigate, and suffer? Because it's actually a little too late that there would be actually no suffering. But we have a lot of tools at our disposal to limit how much of that has to happen in the future. Our inability to adequately manage emissions to date, though, means that adaptation will happen one way or another, as we've already heard this morning, either proactively or in response to natural disasters that are, at least in some cases, exacerbated by changes in the climate. So that was all the downer stuff. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the news from DC. Much of it actually is very positive. First of all, this administration's put $80 billion just in the Recovery Act into working on clean and efficient energy, and energy R&D has been really invested in heavily ever since this administration took office. The Environmental Protection Agency has adopted the first ever fuel economy tailpipe standards for vehicles that should make a very significant difference in the very short term. In 2009, President Obama adopted an executive order on sustainability, which requires every federal agency to reduce its carbon footprint and to develop adaptation plans to protect its mission as well as its facilities. This is a very significant change. It is a wholesale change within the federal government about how we deal with climate-related issues. The adaptation plans from all the agencies are actually due in the next month, and it is really impressive how quickly the agencies have mobilized to respond. There is an interagency task force that is led by the Council on Environmental Quality, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to coordinate the federal government's climate change adaptation activities. There's been an adaptation summit that was held in May of 2010 to help us focus on priorities for the country. And just last week, or a couple weeks ago, we had a sustainability summit sponsored by the National Science Foundation and the National Academies of Science. There's a new suite of almost 30 regional offices supported by the Department of the Interior, climate science centers, and landscape conservation cooperatives. One of those investments is here in Tucson, and you'll be hearing more about that during this conference. We've strengthened bilateral partnerships on energy and climate change with China, India, Brazil, and Russia. We have adopted a 10-year new strategic plan for the Global Change Research Program, which is the investment of 13 agencies focused on understanding the climate changes that are occurring and how to respond to them. The new foci for this program are dramatically different from the way they were in the past, where we were focusing just on understanding climate science. We're now focused on informing decisions, enhancing communication and education, conducting sustained assessments of what it is that we're observing across the country and across the globe, in addition to advancing science. We've made rapid progress with the National Climate Assessment, which is what I do in my other normal life. And we're really trying to build capacity through the assessment for adaptation across the country. There's a major new initiative on oceans, the National Oceans Policy and the National Oceans Council, which is in major deployment mode at the moment, and we think is a game changer for managing oceans and coasts. A major final effort that I think is worthy of note is how active the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology has been, particularly on energy and adaptation issues. They've issued more reports than any previous council and have really done an amazing job of moving the country forward on technology issues. Still, there's lots of challenges for us ahead in the adaptation world. Decision makers are always daunted by how much uncertainty there is about the future, and we are always daunted in helping to translate what it is that they're hearing from scientists into something actionable that they can move forward with some confidence, in spite of the fact that we don't have all the answers today. We know that decision makers are often focused primarily on trends and not on the extremes, and this is a serious consideration when we're trying to limit risk and increase resilience. We know that adaptation is a long-term, multi-generational issue, and it's hard to sell people on the need to invest in the short term, especially in the economic climate that we're in today. We have a hard time explaining whether the extreme events that we're seeing today are in fact a result of climate change, or whether they're natural variability or some combination thereof. We are getting better at being able to explain that, but it's still a serious problem in our relationship with the public. We have lots of institutional barriers and maladaptive policies in every country in the globe. Certainly the United States is one of them. We need to work on those and try to remove the barriers to doing the right thing. And all of this has to happen with major limitations on resources, and we are incredibly constrained, more so than probably people realize. But there is lots of good news, as I've just explained. There is a lot of activity in the federal government, but it is a daily battle, just trying to protect the observing systems that we've already built to understand what's changing around us. But we are optimistic that so much has happened in just a couple of years in Washington, and we hope that we'll be able to carry all of what we've learned forward and look forward to a future when many of these issues about incorporating adaptation into everyday practices are behind us, and that is what we do as a matter of course. I know I speak for all of my colleagues here in thanking you for joining us here in Tucson to help us deal with these very challenging questions and to learn from each other as we work towards solving all of these issues. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning, and wish all of you a wonderful conference, and hope you'll all come visit us in Washington. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Inspired by the conference in Australia, Jean Paludikoff and Andrew Ash and the Marks and others did something very special at the beginning of the last conference that I have blatantly copied. And that is to invite three young scholars to make a few remarks about their concerns about adaptation and their hopes for the conference. And it was difficult to choose, and I used some criteria, just basically 3 younger scholars who I admire. And I'm going to introduce all 3 of them at once, and then they'll come up in turn to speak to you for a few minutes. And the first person is actually somebody who spoke at the opening of the Australian conference, Laura Canavari. And Laura spoke so well, I don't want to raise expectations, but in Australia, that several of us went up to talk to her and asked her what she was going to do next. And as a result of that conversation, I encouraged her to apply for a degree, a master's degree at Oxford University in Environmental Change and Management, which is where she is now a student. So these conferences make all sorts of connections that really change people's lives, and I think Laura's life has been changed. Laura's from Colombia in Latin America. She has a degree in marine science from the University of Queensland. She's done some work with the Inter-American Bank. She had volunteered extensively as a student in Australia with the Environmental Institute of Australia and New Zealand. She was an intern with the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Initiative and worked as a research assistant at the Conservation Lab. And she's doing her master's on adaptation, and she's going to be interviewing some of you at the conference. And I'm proud to be advising her master's. The second young scholar is from Cambodia. And he's a Fulbright Research Fellow at the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University. Picday Ngong holds a Bachelor in Education from the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and also from the University of Tasmania. And he has a Master's in International Development and Environmental Analysis from Monash University. Picday works on forest government. He's in the middle of his PhD right now. In 2007, he won a countrywide essay competition in Cambodia that was sponsored by the World Bank. He's worked in Cambodia on reproductive health issues, on arms control with Oxfam, and received an IDP Peace Scholarship for his research. And then our final speaker will be one of our own, Zach Guido, from the University of Arizona. He's a PhD student in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, and he also works with the Climate Assessment for the Southwest, where he edits the Southwest Climate Outlook that tries to provide climate information important to people in the Southwest. He's also got a concern with impoverished communities around the world. He has a master's degree in geology from the University of Colorado, but he's worked for more than 8 years with rural development in Bolivia, looking at water issues, where he co-founded a non-profit organization, Terra, which tries to improve water access for rural Bolivian communities. So I hope you will enjoy meeting these 3 younger scholars, and I'll invite Laura, first of all, to come up and make a few remarks.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Provia, the University of Arizona, and my supervisor, Diana Lieberman, in particular, for this unique opportunity. And thank you also for the introduction. It is a real honor to stand here in front of all of you at a second International Climate Change Adaptation Conference. Science, in contrast to many other things, is continuously changing. Its foundation pillars are strong, but its potential uses and methodologies are always expanding and being refined. Adapting to climate change requires a serious transformation of the way we think and how we frame our needs and expectations, of the functioning role of current and emerging institutions, and of the ways in which the sciences engage with other actors in society. I feel privileged to live at a time in which traditional models of life are being challenged and in which the key factors for success is collaboration. Never before had individuals and institutions been so willing to share ideas and information. The recognition that acting together, moving away from disciplinary silos, represents the key for an effective response to climate change is radically shifting the operational environment in science. We now move to a new era of knowledge production and discovery, a time that will be characterized by collaborative endeavors, partnerships, continuous transfer of knowledge and technologies, and the reincorporation of traditional and indigenous forms of knowledge in management practices. Climate change is a reality that challenges our intelligence, our strength, and our capacity to organize and act collectively. It is like nothing we have dealt with in the past, and it therefore requires a new level of response. As I have already emphasized, I think that the key for responding to climate change is in collaboration. And by that, I don't mean collaborating only with our colleagues at work, but with other actors in society also. We must then strive to find a balance between retaining the credibility of science as currently held in its ivory tower and making it more participative and inclusive. We must increase its legitimacy and saliency in the eyes of civic society, promote more user-inspired investigations, and work in tandem with practitioners. The faster we move away from reductionist, exclusionary, and isolating forms of knowledge production, the greater will be our chance to surpass this challenge. In working towards adaptation, we must therefore promote multidisciplinarity and engage more with local communities and practitioners. This means adapting current scientific methodologies and objectives to meet emerging societal needs. It is a difficult process, but a necessary one. It is a process that will change us and that will change the ways in which we do science and in which we craft adaptation responses. We now live in the Anthropocene, a new era for mankind. By now, we have so radically changed our environment to be able to call ourselves another force of nature. But I believe that we can turn the climate challenge into an opportunity and use it as a positive force in our planet. This could be a crisis from which we could emerge having reached new levels of social order and equity, with a new and more effective architecture for multi-level governance, and with a much better sense of how to interact with our environment. I see this also as an opportunity to re-empower local communities, indigenous people, and youth all across the world. To conclude, I'd like to say, therefore, that we need to think carefully about what our role as scientists is on this period of change, and how do we wish to value and reward scientific information. We can use the foundation pillars of science as a base, but we should not hide behind them in denial. It is clear that it is now a time where a change in science has to be made, and that we have to engage in a battle that is worth fighting for. So let's open our doors and remind society that we are here, and that with our help, they have a much better chance to forge a better world. Thank you. I hope that
was great. Okay, Pekte.
Good morning. I'd like to start by, first of all, saying that it is an honor, as Laura mentioned, to speak to an audience of this caliber. And of course, I would like to thank Professor Diana Lieberman for inviting me to give this talk. And also, I would like to also thank the conference organizers for sponsoring my participation here today. So as Diana was saying, my research examines the processes under which knowledge on the drivers of deforestation and forest degradations have been produced for the UN REDD+ initiatives. The goal of my research is basically to evaluate if the knowledge that are being produced are socio-ecological. So prior to my PhD program, I worked for about 6 years with government agencies, civil societies, local communities, academic institutions, and private consulting companies on climate mitigation and adaptation policies and strategies, mainly through the Clean Development Mechanism and the REDD+ project, mainly in Cambodia, where I'm from, and also in the neighboring countries like Laos and Vietnam. So I would like to take this opportunity to reflect on some of the experience that I've learned through these years of working with the communities on the ground, to speak to what are the challenges that I see in working on the ground with the communities in regards to climate adaptations and mitigations. First of all, the main lesson that I think I've learned with working with communities is that the capacity of community to adapt to and cope with the impacts of climate change is contingent on various factors such as affluence, education, infrastructure, institutional capabilities and willingness, recognitions of the existence of climate change, and the need for action. What I think is interesting about this lesson that I've been learning is that they are to a large extent comparable with the findings in other academic research papers that I've been reading about, most of which actually come from this audience here. And so thank you for all the wonderful work. And so in addition, these findings have convinced me that even within a country, communities are so highly diverse in their endowments of those attributes. And thus, I think the first challenge for policymakers, researchers, and other relevant stakeholders working at the intersection of global, national, regional, and local scale is on how to incorporate these diversities into consideration when proposing and agreeing upon climate adaptation policies and strategies. My second point is that effective, efficient communication is central to this challenge. It is necessary, in my opinion, to acknowledge and also to applaud the persisting efforts by scientists, for example, the work by Provia and Future Earth, who have argued, among other things, that scientific knowledge has to be communicated to a wider audience of policymakers and also the general public, mainly for two reasons. First of all, it is the larger community that has to make the difficult decisions about how to adapt and cope with climate change, deforestation, and other global environmental changes. Second, because policymakers need to have a high level of confidence in the science behind their choices. And I would like to personally say that I could not agree more with these suggestions. However, drawing from my own experience, working with the local communities, mainly in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam, what I would like to propose as a point of consideration on top of all the wonderful works that the Provia program and the Future Earth are doing is that I would like to propose that there should be more initiatives to think about the way that we can actually strengthen local and international research capabilities to effectively communicate their research projects and significance with various communities in countries where official languages are among the less commonly spoken languages. And with that, thank you. Thank you so much.
Zach.
Good morning. I'd first like to thank Dinah Liverman, the Institute of the Environment, and other conference organizers for this opportunity to speak to you. It's a real honor for me to say a few words about what this conference and the issue of climate adaptation means to me, particularly since many of my ideas are informed by all the papers that you all have written. So again, my name's Zach Guido. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Arizona, studying the impacts of climate changes on water resources with the focus in the Andes. My interest in this topic started 12 years ago when I spent a chilly and frightening night stuck on a bus in a remote corner of the Bolivian Andes. At the time, there was a nationwide protest that had paralyzed the country, and the people were basically making a stand against the lack of access to water. I spent that night watching 40 men huddle around a transistor radio, waiting to hear if the government and their leaders had reached an agreement before letting our bus pass. So in the 3 years that I lived and worked as a volunteer for a development organization in Bolivia, I experienced repeatedly the sometimes tragic collision between limited natural resources and less than effective management. And while the protests I experienced that night wasn't directly caused by changes in climate changes will almost assuredly place additional burdens on management, particularly in resource-strapped regions like Bolivia. This will deepen poverty and increase the number of vulnerable people. For example, I've seen firsthand that the glaciers are shrinking, the same ones that contribute water to more than 2 million people. I've often pondered what would happen if the ice substantially melted, and questions like this are now part of my research. Closer to home, here in the Southwest, about 30 million people draw water from the medium-sized Colorado River, and it's already overallocated. By most accounts, its supply will diminish in the future at the same time as population grows, creating a huge management challenge. Droughts are also problematic here. The historically dry conditions in recent years have reduced irrigation water for farmers and caused ranchers to sell livestock, both threatening livelihoods. As part of my research, we tested whether routine climate summaries can help managers better cope with drought and other climate risks. And we found that synthesizing and interpreting information does inform actions that reduce damages. And this demonstrates just one of many strategies that can help decision makers overcome hurdles. Undoubtedly, climate changes bring new challenges, but they also present new opportunities. If collectively we can get out in front of the changes by informing management and development with the best physical and social science possible, and with the information that they want, we'll not only make communities better prepared, but we can also help make them prosperous. It's also an opportunity to toss out long-held practices that have become stale in favor of fresher ones. Those opportunities are what led me down the academic path, and it is optimism like this that my generation of scholars can inject into the process of finding solutions. It's also at the heart of this conference, and it's why I'm excited to be here. I look forward to hearing from you all what's worked, what's failed, and areas in need of innovative ideas. In my opinion, building stronger and better relationships among researchers and practitioners can make unmatched progress on improving people's lives. And hopefully the sharing here will cascade through research and practice and stimulate actions that better prepare us for possible futures, and will be more prosperous for it. Thank you.
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We've got two keynote presentations, one on research perspectives by Anand Patwardhan, but to start with on policy perspectives by Joel Carmo. I first knew Joel Carmo 30 years ago at YASA when he was directed what was then called the Acid Rain Project, and he's done lots of things in the meantime, but cutting to the chase most importantly now, he's the chief scientist for the UN Environment Programme. He's the first, if you like, the founding chief scientist in the Environment Programme. So, you know, he's our man in the corridors of power and the smoke-filled rooms and what other metaphors you'd like to use. And he's going to talk to us about linking adaptation research more closely with policy. Our two speakers have been asked to talk for 20 to 25 minutes. I'm going to try to hold them to time and embarrass myself and them in that so that we can, keep more to time if we can. I doubt if we will have time for discussion and questions at the end. Let us see, but I'm going to run straight on from one presentation to the other and then see if there is time, which will probably be halfway through the coffee break. Dr. El Carmo, please, sir.
Many thanks, Martin, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thanks very much for the invitation to be able to say a few words about adaptation research, in particular how it relates to policy. So in a few weeks, we're going to be confronted with quite a spectacle as thousands of us converge on Rio, all at the same time, all trying to find a hotel at the same time, and trying to sort out how much progress we've made or not made with regards to sustainable development since the original Rio Earth Summit 20 years ago. And certainly one of the hot topics to be discussed at that summit will be the role of science as it has to do with policymaking and as it has contributed or not to promoting sustainable development. And certainly we're going to be concerned about how science can contribute more to achieving sustainable development. So it's actually quite a good time now to consider how adaptation research is linked to policy in general and how it has helped to further sustainable development and how we might make these links stronger. Now, rather than talk about that topic in a general sense, what I'd like to talk about today are actually three areas where I think there's great opportunities for adaptation researchers to link more closely and to make greater contributions to policymaking. Those are food security, ecosystem management, and disaster risk reduction. But first of all, let me pause and say I'm assuming that there needs to be this link between adaptation research and policy. Not all agree with me. But I think there's some good reasons why we need a strong link. First of all, I think we agree that adaptation research is more than a curiosity-driven type of science. It's fine that some of it is curiosity-driven, and that's an essential element and foundation of science. But I think we might agree, at least I believe, that it's very much has a very strong policy context. Society needs strong and effective adaptation measures, and it simply needs the science to help it develop those adaptation plans. Secondly, I think that given the current economic climate, given the earlier economic climate, it's really difficult to justify adaptation measures, for the most part anyway, simply based upon a reaction to climate change. I think after a lot of experience and research, we believe that it's for an adaptation measure to succeed, it needs to be integrated into existing structures, into existing institutions. And it needs to link with other priorities of policy in that particular location. The third point I'd like to make is that in Rio, we're going to be discussing a lot about the unfinished business of sustainable development, and here adaptation research can play a role in finishing this unfinished business. I think we're going to see in Rio that one of the main topics that are going to be debated is the subject of food security, which takes many meetings and many books, et cetera, about. I think everyone here realizes that adaptation research has already contributed in enhancing food security, or at least contributing knowledge towards enhancing food security in the area of agriculture, in the area of marine fisheries, in the area of inland fisheries. I think the first two categories we're quite familiar with that research, and it's certainly adaptation research has made major contributions. I believe personally in this third area we need to do a lot more work, and that's why I'm going to say a few words rather than about agriculture or marine fisheries. I'm going to talk today about inland fisheries and the role of adaptation research in contributing to the complex of food security, inland fisheries, and its response to climate change. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but the inland fishery production, the annual production, 95% of it comes from the developing world. And the reason that is that it makes up, that fish taken from the inland fisheries make up an essential part of the diets of billions of people in developing countries. 1 out of every 5 Africans consumes fish as an essential part of their diet, and it makes an essential contribution to the animal protein in their diet. Now, not only does it play a very important role with regards to food security in developing countries, but it also plays a major role in economic security. That the value of the inland fishery market in the tropics amounts to around $6 billion per year, not a small number. And it also means a lot for livelihoods. About 3.5 million people in Africa make a direct livelihood by fishing from the inland fisheries. So, on one hand, the inland fisheries play an essential role in developing countries, in food security, and also in livelihoods. On the other hand, it looks like they may be threatened by changes in climate, among other stresses, of course, other stresses associated with development like water pollution or channelization, etc. But we know from research that, for example, we're already seeing an increase in temperature of inland waters that may have a direct impact on fish. That diagram in the upper right there shows some data from back to 1920 in Lake Tanganyika, showing the change in temperature of both the upper level, which you might expect because of the fluctuation year to year in temperature, but what's particularly interesting is the steady increase in temperature in the lower level of the lake, indicating a long-term trend likely to be related to climate change. Now, why are we concerned about water temperature? As I mentioned, warmer temperatures have a direct physiological impact on fish, but the warmer the temperature, the less oxygen can be dissolved in fresh waters, which means less oxygen available for fish and other organisms, but also warmer temperatures generally mean more algal blooms, which disrupt the ecosystem and can have an effect on the fishery. Also, in the areas where you have decreasing precipitation, you're likely to have a lower dilution capacity of your rivers, which means probably higher water pollution levels, lower water quality, and an additional stress on the inland fishery. Or in areas where you have increasing precipitation, it's likely that you're going to have increasing runoff from cities and other areas, bringing nutrients, bringing pollutants from city surfaces into inland waterways, and decreasing their water quality, and also increasing the stress on the inland fishery. I believe when you compare the amount of work that's been done in assessing the relationship between climate, food security, and the marine fishery and agriculture, much less work has been done in the inland fishery, and I encourage you to devote some of your efforts to building up this knowledge base. What kinds of questions are particularly important, I believe, with regards to adaptation research are simply baseline information about the future, about how freshwater systems will change with regards to climate change, both river flow characteristics, but also especially water quality and temperature. Very little work has been done in projecting the chemical characteristics of inland waters, which will have a direct bearing on the sustenance of the inland fishery and thereby a strong connection with food security, especially in developing countries. Now, the other question is, which we need more research on, is how will ecosystems and the fisheries actually respond to these changes expected from climate? And what are the risks, direct risks to food security? Also, the question of adaptation needs a lot of work when it has to do with food security, inland fisheries, and climate change. For example, where should the interventions take place? Or what are the trade-offs in the interventions? Should they be taking place in the river basin level, where we would invest more in ramping up wastewater treatment to protect water quality, which might be degraded under climate change, or should we invest further efforts in flow controls in the face of climate change in order to maintain the integrity of the inland fishery? Or should the accent go on assisting individuals to adapt? And what kind of adaptation is going to work and where? Will it be that consumers are going to have to change their diets to a certain extent in developing countries? What are the options for consumers of fish right now? Or what are the options for the fishes themselves that may be displaced because of the decline of the fishery? Should insurance be made available to them for years where the fish output is very low? Should they switch to other fish species? Should they change their livelihood? Should they migrate? All of this is pretty much an unknown, and I think it's been overlooked by the community, the link between food security, the inland fisheries, and especially in developing countries, and climate change. Now, the second topic I want to talk to you about, and that is the link between adaptation research and policy as it has to do with ecosystem management. And here there are many, many different links. The one link I'd like to talk to you about today is called ecosystem-based adaptation, which is something close to the hearts of those of us at UNEP. It's a priority topic for UNEP because we think that it hasn't been given enough attention. But I have to say, it hasn't been given enough attention, perhaps because it's misunderstood. So, what exactly is ecosystem-based adaptation? Does it mean that it will be people driving endangered animals, warm, furry, endangered animals from one climate system to a better adapted climate system? Now listen to me. Say after me. No, this is not ecosystem-based adaptation. In fact, ecosystem-based adaptation is a people-oriented type of adaptation approach. It means, in this case, it doesn't mean helping out ecosystems, but it means utilizing ecosystem services in order to help people adapt to climate change in different ways. So what does it mean specifically? One example would be reforestation in a particular river basin in a watershed in order to lessen the risk of floods that might be expected because of increasing precipitation or at least showery events in that watershed. Or it might mean intervening in grassland management in order to increase the grassland's resilience to an increased frequency of droughts that may arise as a result of climate change in that area. Or it also means enhancing the diversity of agricultural systems as one of many different strategies in order to make them more resilient in the face of changes in precipitation and warmer temperatures. Or it could also mean intervening in the management of forests and shrublands in order to try and lessen the risk of uncontrolled fires that may arise because of warmer temperatures in that region. But what we have to keep in mind is, again, ecosystem-based management argues that adapting to climate change wouldn't be the only motivation for those kinds of measures, but there would be lots of side benefits. In the case of those different examples would be reducing the risk of disasters, supporting biodiversity, supporting livelihoods, and in some cases even sequestering carbon. So many multi-benefits. But one important issue when it has to do with linking adaptation research and ecosystem management within the framework of ecosystem-based adaptation is that, in fact, not enough, in my view, not enough work has been done in really analyzing the effectiveness of different measures that fall under the rubric of ecosystem-based adaptation. So I'll just talk about one case, and that is the case of coastal protection, using, for example, replanting mangroves, which have declined in area. It's been estimated, some estimates, they have decreased in total area by about 1/3 over the last 2 decades, but trying to reestablish mangrove forests along coastlines as a way of achieving climate protection. Now, there are some data that say, there's some scientific studies that document the effectiveness or not of these kinds of measures. The diagram shown there is from an island off of Bangladesh, and it shows the size of the storm surges as a function of the width of the mangrove forest from around 0 to 600 meters. And you could see there on the y-axis gives the height of the storm surge where there's no mangrove forests on this island. And you could see that it has, that the width of the mangrove forest, according to this study, has some impact of reducing the storm surge height from around 6.2 down to 5.8 or 5.7 meters, whereas at other locations the signal's not so strong. Just in the way of saying there has been some work, but certainly the evidence is not there yet about the effectiveness of coastal protection measures. Now, there was an interesting workshop a couple of years ago, sponsored by FAO right after the tsunami in Indonesia, in the Indian Ocean, in which the experts tried to come to some conclusions about the effectiveness and some of the outstanding questions about the effectiveness of planting mangrove forests inland, further inland pine forests, and other kinds of vegetation as a protective measure, which I think has some lessons for the adaptation research community. And here's some of their conclusions. They said that forests and trees can act as an effective barrier. They call it a bioshield in this case. But the degree of protection, doesn't surprise you, depends on the characteristics of the hazard itself, the force and frequency, for example, or the features of the site and the type of trees, with all of these still being outstanding questions that haven't been really articulated yet. As well as the effect of the protection also depends on the severity of the stress factor, how big the cyclone is, how large the tsunami waves are, and there's actually little quantitative information relating the intensity of the stress to the protection measure. That also, in many cases, the development of bioshields, of planting forests, etc., may not be possible because of competitive land uses, and this also hasn't been documented. Where are there opportunities to replant mangrove forests as a bioshield, and where aren't there? In any event, it's quite interesting what they came up with. It was that we should avoid creating false sense of security, and that in fact, many cases, evacuation may be necessary. And interestingly enough, also in their conclusions, there was a need to translate scientific knowledge into policy-relevant information in these and other cases. So the point I'm trying to make is not that this kind of ecosystem-based management is not effective or is effective, but the fact of the matter is that there's a wide range of options, and I think the scientific community, we need to get busy in articulating for policymakers under what circumstances and under what parameters these kinds of measures will work and may not work. So what does it mean for climate adaptation research? First of all, I would say here would be some of the key questions. What's the effectiveness of different kinds of ecosystem-based adaptation measures, and how would they operate under different circumstances? And then there's the monitoring question. How can the effectiveness of this kind of adaptation measure be monitored, far from being a trivial challenge? And then on what timescales do ecosystem-based adaptation approaches apply? Some observers think that they're only successful in the short term, that once vegetation reaches a stable state, begins to degrade for one circumstance or another, then they cannot be considered reliable protection measures against climate change. Others think that given the certain parameters of an approach, of a reforestation project or a replantation project, that in fact they can be very effective measures over the long term. This is an outstanding question which the science community, I think, needs to articulate. Now, let me get to the third topic where I think that adaptation research has the opportunity to make an even stronger contribution to policymaking and to sustainable development priorities. And that's in the area of disaster risk reduction. Now, we all know that climate is related to many different natural disasters, from droughts and floods and heat waves and forest fires, etc. We thought we were making some progress in actually contending with natural disasters, but still it's an occurrence that we have to confront. In 2008, over 20 million people in the world were displaced by sudden onset climate events. In 2009, 50 million people were affected by severe weather events. Now, what's the link with adaptation research? Well, I think there's many, many different kinds of link, but I think one example, one important example, is the input that climate adaptation research can make right now to the important topic of climate early warning and the development of climate early warning systems, which many institutions are trying to put together so that we can anticipate and better prepare for extreme climate events. Now, I would argue that we've made a lot of progress in early warning, but that now is the time to start talking about a comprehensive climate change early warning system that can serve as a network between different early warning systems for different sudden onset climate events and even medium-term events. I think such a comprehensive early warning system could provide or should provide what I call actionable warnings. So not just delivering a warning on the radio, creating a panic in the population, but in fact a warning that can be delivered to various stakeholders and a warning that they can act on, that they're prepared for. That it would be an early warning system that would integrate climate predictions and meteorological predictions with various vulnerability studies and preparedness planning. This has been done to a certain extent, but I would argue these three elements still need to be integrated much more in early warning systems. And then also it's time to begin to integrate the various early warning systems that exist for famines, for forest fires, for heat waves. Because now we're in the situation where if you live at a particular locale, you may be receiving different kinds of warnings of a different nature from one day to the next without any kind of consistent picture of what the danger is. These early warning systems need to answer the question of where and when climate-related risk will be particularly high and who will be particularly vulnerable to these risks. And they need to operate not only on the short term, and we're making a lot of progress in hurricane warnings, in typhoon warnings, in heat wave warnings, but now, given the development of science, particularly meteorological science, we can now have the capability to make better and better medium-term warnings. And also, given the development of scenarios, more and more climate change scenarios where we can see the robustness of scenarios versus others, I think we're also at the point where we can make multi-year estimates or projections of increasing risk in different areas around the world. And all of these ideas, I think, are ripe for development within some kind of comprehensive climate change early warning system. And then also we need to articulate, as part of these early warning systems, what actions can be taken and should be taken at different levels according to these different risks. Now, there's many different examples, as I mentioned, of different early warning systems now. There's the FuseNet system that provides excellent projections of famine several months in advance for different parts of the world. That map shown there for Africa are estimates for especially Eastern Africa and Central Africa and Western Africa on where the expected food security problems will occur over the coming months because of projected medium-term climate projections. There's the National Hurricane Center projections, and many other different early warning systems exist. I would say that they all share some shortcomings, or in total they share some shortcomings. Most of them only deal with one aspect of climate-related risk. Most systems have large gaps in their geographic coverage. Most systems don't cover the entire early warning landscape, from the generation and observation of meteorological data to the delivery of the meteorological warnings or other risk warnings and preparedness plans so that people can respond to these warnings. Most systems also need improvement in how their warnings are disseminated amongst different users. And I would argue that most of these systems do not draw, at least fully draw, on the valuable research being generated by this community in vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation. So I would say the pertinent questions here are, first of all, how can vulnerability research be brought more closely in line with the needs for early warning? More specifically, how can vulnerability research be used to identify the most vulnerable people in disaster-prone areas and identify the most threatening climate events and how they will play out on this vulnerability? Also, how can the knowledge from the vulnerability research community and the adaptation research community be used to design good preparedness plans in the context of early warning? So, if I can wrap up, I'd like to say that I believe that adaptation research is not a standalone science. It exists in the context of policy. Society urgently needs effective adaptation measures, and it urgently needs science to help it design the right adaptation measures and the right adaptation plans. And therefore, I think it's justified to develop a much stronger partnership between adaptation researchers and the policy community. It could be in any of the three areas that I talked about today: food security, ecosystem management, or disaster risk reduction, or it could be in many other areas. What I think is really important is the fact that we develop a much tighter and stronger relationship. And this can be furthered along by the program of research on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation of climate change, PROVIA, like Martin was referring to before, or it can be, these links can be strengthened in many other different ways. But I think there'll be a big payoff, if I can leave you with a message. I think there'll be a big payoff in strengthening these links, in the sense that I think it will lead to a much stronger relevance, policy relevance of adaptation research. And I believe that an adaptation research with relevance is also an adaptation research with import. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks, Joe. A tour de force, as I expected. Anand Patwardhan is going to speak from the scientific expert point of view, not that Alcamo isn't a science expert, but less from a policy point of view. I always thought of Anand as a social scientist because he's one of those few crossovers, not cross-dressers, I didn't say that, crossovers between those who have been involved in adaptation and those involved in mitigation, at least in the authorship of the IPCC. But it turns out, reading his CV here, that he trained as an electrical engineer originally and then an environmental engineer. More importantly for me, he's a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of PROVIA and is shortly to take up a position as a member of the Scientific Technical Advisory Panel, STAP, of the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility. So a person also with some influence. Anand, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Martin, for that introduction. There's a bit of an acronym soup that you get into when you when you come to climate change and adaptation. Thanks again for this opportunity for sharing some thoughts with you. We had a very warm welcome this morning from representatives from the city and the university. And particularly, I feel really at home just having learned a couple of days ago that you also have a monsoon in Tucson. And given that I come from Mumbai, that really seemed very appropriate. What I intend to do, and we have a time limitation, is in the next 20 minutes, I'd like to start by spending a couple of minutes on setting the stage, sort of from a developing country perspective, how do we see adaptation and its importance of adaptation. And then what I'd like to do is to really share with you some emerging directions, which I think are important, research directions, directions in the way adaptation science is evolving that I think are important and significant for policy and practice. And then perhaps towards the end, in conclusion, share some thoughts with you on the research agenda for adaptation. So if I can To this audience, it might seem like a superfluous question to ask, why adaptation? But perhaps it's important to remind ourselves from, again, a developing country perspective that climate change is going to lead to a significant asymmetry in the distribution of impacts. What we are likely to see is that disproportionately large impacts experienced in the developing world. That clearly, and this was mentioned by a couple of the speakers this morning in the opening session as well, that mitigation is not enough. Even if we reach somehow a 2-degree target, and certainly if we don't, which I think is quite a likely proposition that we will not reach a 2-degree target, we are faced with a very significant level of climate change to which we will have to adapt. And finally, and this is, I think, a really important point that I wanted to mention, and I'd like to thank Joe for bringing this up as well in his talk, is in some sense, managing climate risk is really important for sustainable development. So in the developing world, there is a very large adaptation deficit. We are not well adapted to current climate risks. And so anything that we can do to help in filling that deficit is certainly going to have very significant developmental benefits and advance the development agenda. If one looks at adaptation from the state of knowledge or the state of understanding, state of scientific thinking on it, we see quite a significant evolution over the last 2 decades from thinking about adaptation as purely as a response, sort of almost a mechanistic response. You have climate change, and so you respond to it, to really something which is, we recognize now as much more of an ongoing process. That today, I think, the way we think about adaptation is that it is part of this very complex set of processes that determine the interaction between climate and society. It is not something for 2050, not something for 2100, but it's something that is happening right now. And that has really led to the whole concept of mainstreaming and the importance of thinking about adaptation as an ongoing process rather than as something that happens as a fixed or predetermined outcome sometime in the future. What I'd like to talk about more substantively in terms of sharing some perspectives from research is really four directions. These are by no means comprehensive. These don't cover, there are many, many areas where you have really interesting new research and science that's happening in adaptation, which is important. But these are four that from my own personal research I have been associated with and I thought I would share with you. The first, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on the importance of extreme events. The special report on extremes, the IPCC special report on extremes just came out a couple of months ago. And I think that report really brought out the importance that in many instances, for many regions, for many sectors, the way climate change will be manifested will be through changes in the frequency or intensity of extreme events. The way we will see climate risk and understand it, perceive it and evaluate and respond it will really happen through extremes. And I think that is a direction which is important. And what I'd like to talk upon a little bit within that is the notion of chronic versus acute hazard. The second direction I'd like to talk a little bit about is the need to develop a much richer characterization of vulnerability. So I think we recognize that vulnerability has become a very important aspect within adaptation. And again, in the developing world, what one finds is that how we measure impacts and vulnerability is often very limited. And we need to really develop a much richer characterization if we want to advance the adaptation agenda. The third topic I would talk about a little bit as a research direction is really focusing on better understanding of the process of response. So when we talk about climate risk, we perceive it, evaluate it, and respond to it. That response is not automatic. There are a whole array of social, cultural, contextual factors that determine response. And if we want to be successful in designing and implementing adaptation interventions, we really need to understand how will individuals, households, communities, how will they respond? Whether it's response to early warning, whether it is response to other kinds of signals that we might send them to undertake adaptive or resilient behavior. And the notion of response is also at the multilateral level, and I'd like to spend a minute or two on talking about some new ideas in how to stimulate that response at the multilateral level. So typically, the image that extreme events raises in our mind is the typical low probability, high consequence events. So these are images from the floods. We had very severe flooding in Mumbai in July of 2005, where it was really an extreme event by all indicators. We had 944 millimeters of rain over several hours. And that led to very significant outcomes that lasted for many days. So that's the typical image in our mind, that we think of these 1 in 100 year, 1 in 500 year events, and they lead to these catastrophic outcomes or disasters. But flooding is a chronic problem in Mumbai. I can say with very high certainty that every year in certain parts of the city, they will flood in the monsoon. And what this shows is, basically the distribution of daily rainfall, and you would find that for many years you have rainfall that is very high, so that's typically that we expect, but that every year we have recorded instances of flooding. And 2005, where we had the very severe event from a climatological standpoint, was certainly not an outlier in terms of recorded instances of flooding. There are many other years where we had a lot more flooding in the city. And this is such a chronic problem that the city administration has identified chronic spots. So we know with very high certainty that if you get more than 50 millimeters of rain an hour, there are some locations in the city that will flood. So what are the implications of this? To me, a focus, therefore, that we need to think not just about these low probability, high magnitude events, the 1 in 100 year floods, to which most of policy attention is directed. So for instance, a typical adaptation response here would be to invest in stormwater upgradation systems. But what matters to people is that we have a continuous baseline of chronic hazard. We have flooding every year, and a lot of private response and private costs are actually associated with that chronic hazard. And this raises a number of questions which I think are important for policy and practice. How does this short-term response, which is geared towards this chronic hazard, how does this affect long-term resilience? Does it increase it? Does it decrease it? And how do we manage both the acute and the chronic at the same time, recognizing that this baseline is very important? The second topic I mentioned I would like to talk to you about is trying to develop a richer characterization of vulnerability. And what I'd like to do is to really just share two examples. The first is that if you look at the majority of vulnerability and impact assessments, what you typically estimate, use, or report are loss of human capital, so mortality or morbidity if you look at the statistics, and insured loss. Right? So if you look at most of the standard reporting in the literature, you talk about these two factors, insured losses and mortality, by far. I mean, there are many others, but those are often. Well, in developing countries, most households and small businesses' assets are not insured. So you have a situation now where you are not even observing a certain phenomena because you do not have ability to measure it. I think that's a very important issue, that these losses experienced by households and small businesses are not measured, and so we do not even have an understanding or a characterization of the impacts and vulnerability associated with important segments of the community and the city. The second aspect is that typically interventions focus on relief. So if you had a flood, you want to provide relief measures, provide compensation to those who have lost lives or who are experiencing other impacts. But I think one of the important ideas that has come up recently is the need to focus on recovery and not just relief. That recovery is a process that's part of long-term resilience, the ability of a system to recover from a shock is an important attribute of its long-term adaptive capacity to climate change. And I think we need to see how one can highlight that process of recovery in a more systematic way. So we did a considerable amount of work in Mumbai looking at these unmeasured losses. So we did primary surveys, both for households and for commercial establishments and small businesses. I just want to share with you, give you a sense of the numbers. So if one looks at, for instance, households, we had 3 categories. We had loss of income, because the members of the household, productive members of the household were sick or they were unable to go to work. We had loss associated with damage to the property and also to the household effects or appliances. And when you add all of that up, you get, a fairly substantial amount of estimated costs, which are almost, relative to public losses, almost 4 times that. So if you see, we're about 12 billion rupees. And if you look at public losses, public infrastructure was reported about 2.5 billion rupees, and insured losses about 4.5 billion rupees. So you see that what you are actually being able to measure on an ongoing basis is a very small part of the total magnitude of the impact. We did a similar exercise looking at commercial establishments and small businesses. And there's one interesting point I want to make here is, if one looks at business losses, a very significant amount of loss is associated with inventory. A lot of the small businesses are household businesses. They maintain both raw materials and inventory within the house. And the loss of that inventory is as important as loss of actual equipment or damage to property. But in both instances, what we found is that systematically, we are experiencing much larger losses to much more vulnerable segments of the population than we are conventionally measuring and reporting. We often also tend to think of adaptation as largely being a public response. So we think of building a seawall or doing a storm drainage system, early warning system, typically investments made by public entities. But it's also important to recognize that there are private responses and private costs. And this is just to give you an indication of the kind of private responses that both households and small businesses and commercial establishments did post the 2005 floods. So many of them, for example, raised the surrounding, their houses. They elevated electrical meters. One of the big elements of damage is when you have interruption in power supply, so you raised electric meters. Or you repaired toilets to avoid sewage coming back through. So there are private responses, and they're quite significant. So what are the implications? I think, to me, it really raises the point that we need to develop this much richer characterization of vulnerability, and we need to put in place a system that will actually allow us to observe and measure what is happening, which we do not have at the moment. That the typical losses or insured losses that are reported and reflected significantly underestimate overall impacts, that in terms of the actual human and social consequences, these unmeasured impacts are even more significant, and that there are ongoing private responses to chronic hazard. How are we capturing that when we think about the costs of adaptation? And finally, from a policy perspective, what are the interactions between these public and private responses? The other example I wanted to give in the context of vulnerability is the importance of looking at not just impacts in terms of stocks, but also measures that reflect overall economic activity and allow characterization of recovery. I think in my mind, the whole process of recovery is a very important element of resilience, and our ability to characterize that process is quite significant. What this shows is one of the, in many cities in India, we collect an entry tax called octroi. So all goods movement of goods across city boundaries, municipal boundaries, they pay an entry tax. And octroi collections, so this tax collection is usually a good indicator of what is happening within the city as a whole in terms of economic activity. And what this slide shows is the first bar is the monthly average. You see, of course, a weekly variation. So this is a Sunday to a Sunday. So Sunday collections are low, truck movements are low. Monday is high. 26th July was the day of the floods. You see a dramatic drop in octroi collections the subsequent day, and you see a gradual recovery thereafter. So in some sense, this is a measure that is not, we are not measuring octroi collections for the purposes of impacts, but this presents a very interesting and useful proxy to think about what might happen. A similar, just to give you a visual sense, this is another proxy variable which is interesting, which is electricity. And this is electricity consumption in kilowatt hours. And you can see, again, there's a variation, a weekly cycle. This is a Sunday. But then you see the drop during the floods, and then you see a process of recovery after the floods. So one of the challenges, I think, is we need to assemble a set of metrics and measures that will allow us to tease out different attributes or different aspects of vulnerability and impacts. It's not just the mortality or insured loss, but the informal sector loss, uninsured loss, as well as the whole issue of measures that allow us to characterize recovery. So I have a few minutes, I think, 4 or 5 minutes left. So let me move on a little bit more quickly and share with you some insights on the third aspect which I mentioned, which is the importance to better understand the process of response. And the example I'd like to share with you is some work we've done looking at early warning systems, because, and I can assure you this is not pre-planned. I had no idea that Joe was going to talk about early warning systems, but it turns out that's a happy coincidence. The success of adaptation interventions depends very critically on the effectiveness of response. If you can create an early warning system, but unless you're sure that people will actually interpret the information, receive the information, and act on it, the intervention is not successful. And so there are two aspects. The first is the whole aspect related to the processing of information, so the generation, delivery, perception, evaluation of information, and then the second really related to what extent does that affect the evacuation response. And so we did some work looking at early warning systems for tropical cyclones in South India. Just to give you an idea of the study location, 2 states of Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, several districts. There is a fairly well-established framework for looking at the warning response process that characterizes the characteristics from the terms of the sender, the warning system, sender characteristics, the response process, and then the receiver characteristics. Many attributes and factors have been studied in the literature for this. I'll just give you a few examples. One of the interesting things that we found is that it relates to uncertainty. So typically we might assume that the more certain the warning, the more likely is it to be taken seriously. And we actually found something a little counterintuitive, which is that because individuals know already that warnings are not certain, if you actually give a very certain warning, they tend to discount it. So they understand that there is uncertainty inherent in warning forecasts. And they make actually their own estimates about these uncertainties. So in fact, they would prefer a message that acknowledges uncertainty to one that appears too certain. They may just reject it, thinking this is false alarm. Another interesting finding was about environmental cues, that when people receive a warning, they don't just take the warning as is, but they interpret the warning in the light of other cues, both social cues and environmental cues. And they play a very important role in determining how exactly that information is interpreted, assessed, and leads to response. And so, for instance, factors like observing environmental cues becomes important. Role of the community leader in how the information is interpreted. And there is a significant reliance on the manifestation of associated environmental cues and not just the warning. So people really want to have that warning confirmed by what they see and what leaders in the community are telling them before they will act. Traditional knowledge, I can see that Martin is giving me a signal, so I'll try and wind up quickly. Traditional knowledge we found is also important. And again, this is a very interesting situation where that over time, deterioration in traditional knowledge actually can affect the ability to respond. Okay, so let me skip that. The bottom line, I think, is that response is not automatic. Even if we generate a warning and deliver it, there are a variety of factors that will influence how it is perceived, evaluated, and then ultimately how it is acted upon and will lead to response. Okay, let me skip the multilateral action on adaptation for the moment and spend the last couple of minutes in trying to sort of suggest to you that there are interesting new areas opening up in adaptation, what that might mean in terms of a research agenda. In my view, a research agenda for adaptation really is about new knowledge and also about new approaches for knowledge generation. We need new disciplinary knowledge, so we need more fundamental disciplinary insights, for example, into behavioral science, into how people respond to information, how they understand and perceive risk. So we need that disciplinary input. But we also need cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge. So how do we really connect, for example, information? How do we measure? What kind of indicators do we use? How do we design institutions and think about governance? So these are sort of cross-disciplinary. But fundamentally, I think we also need new approaches for knowledge generation. I think, and this point has been made several times, that adaptation is not something for the future. It is something that is happening now and needs to happen now, which means we need to really advance simultaneously the research agenda and the practice agenda, which also means that in some sense, we need to sort of link the generation of knowledge with deriving insights from it and its use. Which would also mean that it's not just the agenda, but also how it is implemented becomes very important. That we need to have an involvement of users and stakeholders in the process of adaptation research. It's not that we, the research community, do it and then communicate. So I think that notion of communication has to be replaced by one where we have a much closer engagement and involvement. That in a sense you cannot do research without simultaneously thinking about capacity building. Capacity building is not just for implementation. And that the process of research should in many ways foster implementation, because this is not something we're doing for the future, we're doing something for now. And if that process of research can foster implementation, I think we will be doing a great service. So let me conclude. I think adaptation is a necessity. It is happening now and is required now. What we are adapting to is not clear. It may never be fully clear, and in many ways it is irrelevant because we will never have complete certainty. So we are rather better off thinking about it as in a risk-based way, where we are continually faced with risks and we have to respond to them. I personally think this is a really exciting area for science, both in terms of interdisciplinary research, in terms of the way we are likely to carry out science, the way we will engage with stakeholder and user communities. And finally, I think, if things go the way they go, we might find that we have surprises in store if we actually do cross some of these tipping points that lead to large-scale long-term changes in the climate system, where we will find that many of our standard assumptions and analytical tools actually break down. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Anand. It's exactly what we wanted. And I had not dared hope with Diana that we would get such complementarity between these two, which was very satisfying indeed. Put your hands together with me to thank Joe and Anand very much.